Hello, everyone. Welcome to the QuantUniversity guest lecture series. It's been a while since we have done this live presentation, and I want to just give you a couple of updates of what has happened in the last few months. I taught two courses for Northeastern University, a course in machine learning, data science, and productionizing machine learning. And with all the talk about OpenGPT and large language models, it has been an interesting semester trying to incorporate all the new advances which we have seen in the financial services and also in the machine learning world. Another update is we did a couple of courses for the CFA Institute. We had people from more than 15 countries join into the program, and we trained people on how to use data science and machine learning in the financial services space. And it's always fascinating to see the new innovations which are happening in the area and how we could potentially incorporate some of these newer technologies as we bring them and integrate them into our regular work practices. In addition to that, as many of you know, I've been writing a book on artificial intelligence risk management, which is taking quite a bit of time. I always underestimate how much time it takes to write things. And it's always when you start putting pen to paper, you realize that there is so much thinking to be done. And it's not just going to be a fluent, just let's get the words on paper and get it done kind of a thing. So it's been a wonderful learning experience. We have a newsletter, which has also been dormant for a while and which we are going to restart again. But it has been overall a busy semester and a lot of learning and a lot of interactions with various practitioners and academics and researchers. And finally, on the fun side of things, I had a chance to visit outside of the United States, a couple of countries. I got a chance to go to Ireland. I got a chance to go to Copenhagen, Denmark. And last week for Thanksgiving, I was fortunate enough to take a break after many years with family to go and visit London. So overall, it's been a very productive and a very good quarter. And I'm glad to bring the guest lecture series back to life, and we're going to be having regular sessions from now on. And to kick it off, we've been tracking the whole area of bias and discrimination and the whole area of algorithmic audit for a while now. And now that regulations are catching up, and we've been seeing a lot of new proposals, some laws already in place, and of course, the New York law, the local 144, and also the one which is going to be going live on January 1st, 2023. It's basically if any company is using what are called as AEDT, or the automated employment decision tools, then the requirement to have an independent audit on the usage of the software if these tools are being used. So there's been a lot of discussion, and for people who are tracking this area, it's one of the first few laws being deployed in a large area of New York, and been a lot of questions, a lot of different interactions from the academic space, from practitioners, from vendors, from lawyers, from policymakers, from people who are concerned about, like, the rollout. And we thought it would be nice to have a series of discussions wherein we as practitioners and academics and researchers focusing on looking at artificial risk management. What does it mean to adopt these practices? And in that realm, I'm very pleased to invite Nick Schmidt, a dear friend and also a collaborator on various projects, who has been looking at bias and discrimination for many decades now. It used to be years, and now it's decades. Nick doesn't look old, but he has a ton of experience. And I would like to, just formally introduce him. So Nick Schmidt is the CEO of Solus AI and an AI practice leader at BLDS. He has more than 2 decades of experience working in the intersection of statistics, law, and regulatory policy. In recent years, his primary focus has been in the statistical analysis of discrimination in algorithmic decision-making, especially in the areas of consumer credit, housing, insurance, and employment. At BLDS, Nick has provided expert guidance to companies and regulators addressing questions on algorithmic fairness, explainable AI, robust model risk and model governance practices. And outside of BLDS, he has led the development of Solus AI, software platform that tests and mitigates algorithmic discrimination. So this is the first session in the series focused on this whole rollout of the bias audit law, which is what the industry knows it as. Next week, I'm going to be doing a presentation on a similar topic, but bringing in some tools and bringing in some materials we have put together for the algorithmic auditing course, which QuantUniversity offers. So you'll get a chance to peek into some of the materials. And if you're on the practitioner side, thinking about how do we do these kinds of audits, some of the materials next week would be helpful. And also, if you are a company who's potentially going to be affected, or if you are questioning whether this particular law is going to be applicable to you, it should give you some more information so that you can bring in some internal best practices and answer some of the questions in place. So that's next Tuesday at 12 o'clock. And today we are going to have discussion with Nick, and Nick's going to be doing a formal presentation, and we'll say the last 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please type it in the question answer window or the chat window, so that way I can monitor it, and later in the session we can have a discussion with Nick. So today's topic is about AI audits for bias and discrimination. So Nick is going to take a big picture view of what this whole area is about, and then drill down into some of the details, which is specific to the local law 144. So welcome, Nick. Welcome to the program, and I'm glad you're here, and I will offer the stage to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sri. It's always a pleasure to come here, and one of the honors of working in this field is working with you. So thank you for this opportunity. And can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, excellent. So today I'm going to talk about AI audits for bias and discrimination. And I'm going to sort of go up a little bit higher level and talk about audits generally, and AI audits generally, but then really focusing on bias and discrimination. I'm also going to be a bit general and talk about employment audits generally, and then really be specific about the New York law. Because ultimately, the New York law, if you just read it and just follow all that it requires, it would probably be a couple-minute long discussion. But obviously, there's a lot more to it. And so you really need to understand what the background is, what you do with these results, as well as how you can proceed in a way that helps your business to stay compliant and stay safe from any kind of reputational, legal, regulatory problems that might arise. So let's see. So Sri introduced me, so I won't spend too much time talking about myself, but just about my company or companies. BLDS is fair lending analytics and also employment consulting company that's been around since the mid-1970s in various iterations. We focus on statistical analysis of discrimination is our primary area of practice. And we're regularly engaged by courts, regulators, as well as many Fortune 500 and smaller companies. And then I'm also the CEO of Solas AI, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But ultimately, Solas came out of my consulting work, and what we do is we assess whether or not there are problems with an algorithm in terms of discrimination. And if there are, we actually do something about it. So it's not just about measuring discrimination. It's also about mitigating it when it's found. What I want to talk about today is I'm going to start very high level and say, why should we care about model fairness? And hopefully that's an obvious question to answer, but it may not be. And so I want to touch on that. Then I'm going to talk about what is model bias and discrimination, particularly under legal definitions, because ultimately when we're thinking about an audit, we're likely going to be thinking about an audit from a regulatory or legal framework. So what is that bias audit that we're going to talk about? And then who conducts it? What do we do when we are auditing a system for bias and discrimination? And ultimately, what do you do with your results of your audit? And I think that that last part is the absolute most important, because as I mentioned, just complying with the New York City law requires very little, but making sure that you are safe in publishing your results, that's really the key. Why should we care about model fairness? And what is it? Well, this is the example that I love to show, and Sri has unfortunately seen it about 500 times in my demonstrations. But what it talks about is really the algorithm that set it all off, that really started this nationwide, worldwide discussion about fairness in algorithms and fairness in AI. And what it was it was found that three facial recognition algorithms were substantially more likely to misidentify people of color than white people, and even more so women over men. And so this one study found that only 1% of white men the error rate for white men in identifying gender was 1%. For white women, it was 7 times higher at 7%. 7 times the error rate sounds terrible until you go over to the right side of the page where we've got 12% error rate for men of color and a horrendous 35% error rate for women of color. That's awful, and it's terrible. And it slipped by and no one realized it until it came out, year, 2 year, 3 years after these algorithms were already in place. And what do you think that facial recognition algorithms are used for? It's high stakes, high risk environments. And here we are misidentifying people of color. It's really a dangerous situation. And one of the other reasons, in addition to it being such a high stakes problem, that I like to talk about this is I think this is an example of no malice. I cannot imagine, and I've never seen any information that suggests that anybody who put these facial recognition algorithms together was in any way trying to discriminate. They were not trying to get a less accurate model for people of color. They just didn't have the right data, and the algorithms weren't trained correctly. And that's what led to this. And so that's what's really important, is that it doesn't matter that you don't have, or it doesn't matter that a person doesn't have the intention to discriminate. Ultimately, an algorithm improperly trained or trained on the wrong data or insufficient data or any of a number of other problems may actually discriminate. And so we have to be careful about these things, regardless of how good a person we are. Another one I like to talk about is the Apple Card. 2 people on Twitter with giant followings said that their wives received lower credit lines on the Apple Card than they did. Despite at least one situation, the wife's FICO score was higher than the husband. Well, that came out and it was an enormous mess. And what I like to show is on the right, this Twitter from the CEO of Goldman Sachs saying, "I'm sorry that we had these problems." So even if you don't care about discrimination, it's really not a good thing for your career when your CEO has to tweet an apology. So I like to think of this as a business problem, a personal problem, societal problem, and an ethical problem. It's something that we all need to work to solve. So understanding bias and discrimination, there are many frameworks. There's a lot of great academic work that's going on. But ultimately, if we're thinking about an AI audit and we're thinking about regulatory compliance, what we want to think about is discrimination and bias as it's measured under the law. Now, I want to be quick to say that I'm not a lawyer, not trained as a lawyer, so don't take my advice on the law specifically, get the advice of a lawyer. However, I have been doing this for a long time, and this is the experience that I have. So there's really, as I understand it, a legal framework around discrimination and bias that's focused on a few different concepts. One is disparate treatment, another is disparate impact, proxy discrimination, and finally, model validity. And excuse me, disparate treatment, sort of the most obvious one, is when there's an explicit, even if it's unintentional, consideration of a class characteristic. So I'm not going to give that woman a loan because she is a woman. I am not going to hire this person because they are a particular race, age, gender, whatever it might be. That is disparate treatment. In a model, it would be including a feature for, are you African American? Or did you go to a predominantly African American school? Whether or not that's disparate treatment, it probably is. And you'd probably get in deep trouble for that. Disparate impact, somewhat more subtle, but it's really the thing that's at play to a large degree in the New York City law. And they're factors with a valid but discriminatory effect. So if you think of education as an example of an employment characteristic, African Americans, because of history in our country, have lower average education levels. So not individually, of course, but on average, there are fewer African Americans with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, PhDs, and so forth. Now, if you include education as a factor in an employment algorithm, what you're going to find is that overall, African Americans are disadvantaged. That is just going to be a fact, unfortunately. However, education is usually considered a valid factor in most jobs, certainly most white-collar jobs. And so this is something that is a valid factor, but it's discriminatory. And we are going to want to measure this in many audits. Proxy discrimination, those are factors that nearly identify group membership. So they might be something like, are you a member of a particular club or fraternity, sorority, things like that, where it is very close to specifically identifying group membership. Maybe do you attend a traditionally women's college, something like that, where it's no longer 100% men or women, but it's pretty much pointing to it. That's proxy discrimination. And model validity. This is another important one. This is especially important in employment algorithms, where it's the predictive quality of the model is meaningfully different by group. So you might have a situation where a person is able to perform, or the measure of job performance works really well for women, but not well for men, or vice versa. And that would be an example of a model that is differentially valid.
So Nick, can I ask a question
Yeah.
in the previous slide? So just so that we can set the context for the discussion, the New York law, when you talk about the legal framework, does it cover all the four, or is it only focused on specific kinds of discrimination bias?
It really is, it's focused on, in terms of its measurement, on disparate impact, because it doesn't ask about questions of causality or validity, and it doesn't get into the factors that are actually in the algorithm. So it's really just saying, on an overall level, are we seeing differences in outcomes? Are African Americans or women or whomever it might be receiving employment outcomes that are less favorable on average? Now, what's interesting about this is the idea is that these measures should capture disparate treatment, proxy discrimination, model validity, but they won't necessarily do that. You might be treating African Americans badly, specifically, like really doing something racist and discriminatory, but that factor is small. And so it's not actually driving a significant result, but it's still discrimination. It's still illegal discrimination. And so I think that the framework to think about these audits from is this framework of disparate impact. But if you're not also doing some sort of back-end work on these other forms of discrimination, you're leaving yourselves open to some real liability.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. And I think I covered the conceptual frameworks a bit, but just to drill it home a little bit more, disparate impact we can think of as conceptually we're all equal. And the idea is that if it weren't for historical discrimination, if it weren't for past, present, maybe even future discrimination, expected discrimination, we would all have, on average, equal outcomes. There wouldn't be, not individually, of course, but African Americans wouldn't achieve lower job outcomes because their education levels would be the same on average as whites, non-Hispanic whites. But since that's not the case, there is this discrimination. That's this idea of disparate impact. And we'll oppose that as opposed to what we like to call what you see is what you get. And the idea there is that people fundamentally have different skills and abilities. And those may end up manifesting in group level differences. And discrimination only comes about when those differences are over or underestimated. And the example of this is that most firefighter jobs have some sort of weightlifting requirement. You have to be able to lift weights in order to become a firefighter. Well, women on average, again, not individually, tend to be not as strong as men and not be able to lift as much weight. So that is a fundamental difference in skills and ability that is going to lead to a group level difference. Now, it would only be discrimination on this basis if the firefighting organization, the city or whoever's hiring firefighters says, well, we're going to penalize women even more than just the amount by which they naturally are going to be able to lift weight less than men. And so that's just two different frameworks for understanding discrimination. Now, getting into the AI audits themselves, these are huge, really, in scope and potential. And, this is creating a real industry for people like Sri and me, and the ability to do these kinds of audits. And on the right-hand side is something that we have from a group called AIRS, AI Risk and Security, and it was a group that I worked on the bias and discrimination portion of a white paper that's available at that website, hosted by Wharton. And in this white paper, they talked about all the different risks that can come about in an AI system. And those are listed on the right. And you can see that there's just an enormous amount of risk. And the testing and trust is one of the most important. And having a lack of transparency, having a bias, and then thinking about compliance. Are your policies even being followed? These are some of the things that we would think of as important in an AI audit for discrimination and bias, as well as incorrect outputs. We want to know whether or not you're actually using the system as you intend to. And I think that really goes to this question that it's an important thing to consider, which is that there is a system to an algorithm. It's not just the model itself. It's important to look at the entire pipeline from the acquisition of data, the understanding of the business problem that you want to solve, the algorithm that's being built on it, how you're optimizing, what's coming out of the algorithm, and how it's being used. Because in each of those points, there's a potential for bias and discrimination to creep in and potentially even perpetuate and become exponentially more difficult to solve. And so we want to focus in an AI audit on those places and see whether or not there's any problems. And so thinking about the model system or the AI system, we want to think about the algorithm, and we want to ask some questions about validity. So is the model predicting approximately equal for African Americans and Hispanics and whites and Asians and any other racial group? Same thing for men and women, older people, younger people. Is the algorithm doing the right thing? And so if we think back to that facial recognition software, that was a piece of software. It was an algorithm that was fundamentally not valid for one or two groups of people. And that's what we want to try and understand in this first part is the algorithm working the way we think it should for all of the groups that is being scored on? Systems and operations. This is something that I think is really a policy question, and or when I am doing these audits, ultimately oftentimes becomes a policy question. Do you have sufficient policies, and are you following the policies that are reviewing these systems to make sure that what you think is happening is truly happening? Another question that I often ask is, how is this algorithm going to be used? And it's important to ask everybody involved, because it turns out that these algorithms oftentimes have lives of their own, particularly as we're moving into this age of more data, more models, more algorithms, and everybody's a little bit too happy and too excited about them, in my opinion. They're being used in many places and being deployed in many times when compliance, risk management, legal doesn't know they're being used that way. Sometimes even parts of the business don't know how they're being used. And this, what I call usage creep, is incredibly dangerous when it comes to discrimination and bias, because you can have a model system that's built for one purpose that is not discriminatory, that's gone through thorough testing, and you use it on another population or for a different usage, and all of a sudden you have massive legal, regulatory, and reputational problems. And this can happen very frequently in banks, for instance, using fraud models as credit models. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's really dangerous to do that. Using marketing models for credit decisions or something credit related, that's almost always problematic. So you have to be extremely careful about how you're using your models. The data, I think that's what most people think about. Think about biased data. Bias comes in, bias comes out. That, of course, is true, but there are different levels of bias in data. And you have to think about all sorts of things, not only the variables, but variable quality. Does variable quality depend on race, on gender, things like that? Oftentimes it does. Missing values, are people underrepresented? Quite frequently, especially in credit, employment, really, unfortunately, everything I work in, African Americans, Hispanics tend to almost always be underrepresented in data. And to the extent that they interact with the system differently, that is going to mean that the model is biased and is not as valid or not as predictive for them. And so these are the things you have to consider. Going back to the algorithm, we have to say, okay, if one group is missing more frequently than another, how are you handling missing values? You may not have a problem in the training of the data if you're only looking at people who have values, or you're doing some sort of encoding for missing values. But once you actually go out into the real world, you're handling them differently, and now you've got discrimination. And I'm throwing out all these examples of little things that as you're doing an audit, you have to consider them, because this is where the discrimination is going to come from. It's very exceedingly rare. I don't know if I've ever seen anything explicit where a model or a model builder is doing anything completely nefariously, obviously racist. It's always more subtle than that. And so we have to be very careful and cognizant of where this discrimination can come in. Usage, I really described that under operations, and then monitoring. We have to have a regular monitoring process. We want to not make it so frequent that we're getting tons of false positives, but we want to make sure that if there's model drift in terms of discrimination and bias, that we're handling it, and we're handling it just as we would, or with the same sort of care that we would if there were quality drift. Thinking of, and I'm going to take a sip of water. We're going to audit an AI algorithm. I'm actually going to skip to the end because I think it's sort of funny. The New York law describes an independent auditor as a person or group that is not involved in using or developing an automated employment decision tool that is responsible for conducting a bias audit of such AEDT. In other words, the bar is low. Pretty much anybody can be an independent auditor under this definition. I think that you probably don't want to just hire anyone. What you want to start thinking about is how different organizations that have faced these kinds of hurdles have handled audits and have handled compliance. And really what I talk about above that one snippet is more about that. And it's not just about a single audit, but it's about a compliance process that I think if you want to have an effective audit, you need to have an effective compliance process, or else your audit's going to come up with some really potentially bad results, and it's not going to be reliable in the long run. So regardless of whether or not you're in a highly regulated system or industry, I think looking to financial services in particular for what financial services has done really since Sarbanes-Oxley in terms of model governance has been very valuable and could be applied to virtually any industry, I believe. And in fact, I'm helping to do that in healthcare and also in life insurance to some degree. And many other fintechy companies or what I call regulatory adjacent companies are also putting these kinds of practices into place, model governance practices. And we have, in terms of responsibility, what we want to think about is the business itself has responsibility. So this is the modelers as well as the business that is using the model. They really need to be the first line of defense against discrimination and bias. One of the most important things you can do when you're building a model, for the purpose of building a good model, for the purpose of building a model that is not discriminatory, think about it. Think about what you're putting into it. Ask if you would want to be scored by it. Would you want your wife or husband or children or neighbor to be scored by it? Simply asking that question oftentimes brings about some really interesting results. And that's how I think the first line of defense can be almost the most effective. Moving out to internal compliance and internal audit, then the board, then looking at external regulators or external auditors, and then finally regulators in the courts. They will audit your algorithm if you're not careful. And ultimately, what we really want, or what a business would really want, is to have someone other than a regulator in a court auditing the algorithm. Thinking about employment tests as kind of the basis for an algorithmic audit and bias. We actually have a long history of doing these kinds of audits. I've been doing them for 20-ish years, and they've been around for decades, probably since the 70s or maybe even earlier. And employee tests are really no different than an algorithm in that if you think about it, you go in and you sit down for a test, and it's going to try and find out if you're going to be a good assistant manager. And it asks you a bunch of questions about your behavior, asks you a bunch of math questions, various other things, ultimately scores you, and you may or may not get the job. An algorithm really isn't that different. You can think of all the features of the model as the questions in the test, and you can think about the algorithm itself as the scoring process. What's nice about thinking about it that way is there really already is a good framework for assessing discrimination in employment tests. So we can use this to assess discrimination or potential discrimination in an AI system, whether it be employment or otherwise. I think the important characteristics of an auditor are that they have to understand the legal background and the framework for discrimination testing. One of the wonderful things that's happened in academia is there's been a huge amount of research on what it means to discriminate. And while that is really wonderful work, and I hope that it moves forward and gets brought into the legal framework where appropriate, ultimately you don't want to be on the forefront of compliance. What you want to be is making sure that you are following the law. And so it's important for the auditor not to be putting forward their own agenda, but to be using the metrics that are standard practice and what a regulator or a court would expect to see. I think another characteristic is they should understand labor markets. They should understand the relevant industry, and they need to understand statistics because statistical concepts are the framework of these measurements, and not understanding inference, statistical significance, multiple testing, things like that are going to get you in a lot of trouble. And then the last one I put in, and I kind of debated whether or not to do this, understands the importance of working under attorney-client privilege. When you're just conducting a discrimination or bias audit, oftentimes you're working directly with counsel, whether inside counsel or outside counsel. And it's very important so that the client can get unvarnished, fully vetted, and but honest advice that they'd be able to hear this under attorney-client privilege. And there are a lot of people who don't understand that and make mistakes with that. And it can be really quite catastrophic for a customer or a client that doesn't understand that. The professions that typically perform employment audits are IO psychologists, economists and statisticians. Notice I didn't say data scientists. I said statisticians. It tends to be an older group that's doing it. And then lawyers as well. And so if you're thinking, okay, these are all really great things, but what about New York City's local law 144? What's required of that? I would say it's the ability to do basic arithmetic in Excel. And I will show you why that is. However, what I'd say is what's required to deal with the outcomes of these audits is everything I was talking about in the first two bullets. So you really need to be prepared to handle the outcome of these audits because they may not be as positive as you would like it to be. So thinking about the test for bias, the New York City Local Law 144 proposed two methods, and they're really the same thing. One is used for selection of binary outcomes, so yes or no, do you get the job, do you not get the job, or do you get to move forward in the application process? And that's what's known as the adverse impact ratio, and it has a long history of use in employment analyses. The other thing is actually that mathematically essentially the same, but instead of being just for binary outcomes, it's for average scores. So those hats should actually be bars. I just realized that. I've used this presentation about 50 times and no one's pointed that out. Thank you. But those should be, it should be the average of the protected group divided by the average of the reference group. And I'm going to show a problem with that, but to know that those are what is going to be expected of you. And You can see those are very easy to calculate. Just requires a little bit of addition, subtraction, division. There are a couple other metrics that I throw out as well. One is standardized mean difference. I'm going to show you the advantage of that over the impact ratio. And then the other is the residual standardized mean difference. And that's used to assess validity, oftentimes. So what's wrong with the impact ratio? Well, it can be easily manipulated. And I think this is important. And I'm not showing this because I want anyone to manipulate it, but I'm showing it because I think that the law needs to be changed most likely so that it really is fair to everyone who's trying to comply, and we make sure that everybody's treated equally or treated well. So suppose Nefarious Incorporated has a model that predicts the probability that an employee will stay for a year or more. And they're more likely to give a person a job or a raise if that person is likely to stay. So a higher probability is favorable. And we find that the male average prediction is 60%, while the female average prediction is 40%. So what you're going to see is disparate impact here. Men are more likely to stay than women, and as a result, men are going to be treated more favorably by the algorithm. This ratio, the impact ratio of 40% divided by 60% gives a value of 2/3. That would almost always be considered problematic and should be reviewed more closely. But let's say Nefarious Incorporated doesn't want to do the work. They decide to rescale their score. Instead of being from 0% to 100%, they decide to make it 800 to 1600. And I just kind of randomly chose 800 to 1600. You can use virtually any number other than 0 to 1. So what I show here is first that if you just do a linear transformation, you're doing literally nothing other than a linear transformation to that 0 to 100%, what you can see is we start with the impact ratio of 0.67 on the left. By scaling it, you can increase that ratio to 0.88. 0.88 is oftentimes not considered problematic. So the company has done nothing to improve its processes, but it has gone from having evidence of disparate impact to not having evidence of disparate impact. And it's problematic that a company can do that with no real effort put into place. And I'll just contrast that to the standardized mean difference, or SMD. Because it's standardized with the standard deviation, you end up with the same number regardless of the scaling. And the SMD has its own issues, but it's still better than the impact ratio. So working with the results of the bias audit, that's what I want to really focus on for the next few minutes, because this is the issue, is that almost always you're going to find some sort of issue when you use those two measures that are proposed by the New York City law. And the New York City law requires those results to be published, which means that you now have public information that implies that the algorithm you use for hiring has evidence of bias. That is not going to go over well with your employees, with the New York Times, with public advocates, with regulators. So you better do something about it. And this is where we need a framework for understanding discrimination, understanding why you might have those problems, as well as mitigating it. And so what we want to do there is we want to go back to the algorithm. So as part of this New York City audit, you had to do these tests. You found that there's a problem. Maybe you thought, oh, all I have to do is do these tests and I'm done. But now you've got public evidence that you've got some problem. You want to go back and you want to review the input of the model. See whether or not there's anything that really could be disparate treatment. You'll then want to test for validity. is the model actually predicting what it should predict? Is it making accurate inferences? And there are different types of validity studies that can be done, and I outline them, but you have to really do all three of them in order to be assured that your model is a reasonable predictor. Then you want to understand what's causing it to discriminate. And it's causing the model to discriminate. We're not asking you sort of, I mean, to some extent you have to ask a broad sort of societal question, but that's not the point here. What we want to do is we want to use some sort of technique to understand why this particular model is causing these negative results. And with that information, you can start to make a rebuttal to those very high level disparate results that you had to publish. And then the final thing that you want to do is some sort of reasonable searchatory alternative model. Now, what does that mean? What it means is that while your model that you've got in place has some level of discrimination and some level of quality, it may be the case that you could take a little bit of a hit of quality, maybe even not much of one at all, and tweak the results and actually find a fairer model. And that's what we do at Solas, and it's kind of the primary function that the software does, is finding those less discriminatory alternatives. But you can at least start to do it on your own, for sure. You know, I've got a couple other slides on that, but I think what I'd like to do is just show one last slide, and then we can open it for questions, if that's okay, Sri. So one of the things that I'm often told is, my model is my model, there's no other model, it's the best model, and we, you know, go away. And while I am quite sympathetic to that and understanding, what we've found in AI and machine learning is, in fact, there is not just one model. There's a multiplicity of models that have similar quality, but may be entirely indifferentiable on quality, but have different levels of fairness. And that's what this picture shows here, is each dot represents a different model that was built. And on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we have the level of disparity. So this is the level of discrimination. On the y-axis, we have the level of quality. And these are scaled so that 1 indicates the value, the quality, and the disparity of the model that was originally brought to us. And so a value of 1, indicates the model that was our original model, or the baseline model that our client made. And so the question is, can we go, how far over to the right can we go? In other words, how much can we mitigate and minimize discrimination while keeping the model quality reasonably high? And so that would be up. So our goal is to go as far up and to the right as we can. And what we found in this particular model is that we were able to substantially reduce discrimination. We reduced the disparity by 20%, so that down at this 0.8, with only 1%, 2% or so drop in model quality, which the customer ultimately decided was not meaningful when compared to the improvement in disparity. So in fact, you can improve things. And this is one example of such a thing, and I think is really indicative of the potential for the work that can be done. And when we're thinking about an AI audit, and you publish the results of your discrimination testing, and there's something wrong there, what you want to be able to follow up with is something like this, where you say, okay, there was a problem, but we improved it as much as we could. You know, there's still a societal problem that we as an employer cannot solve, but we've done what we can. And that, I think, is the best defense to any problems that may arise as a result of these audits. So with that, I will stop and see if we have any questions.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for the presentation and also sharing some of your experiences on this whole area of audits. Now, to be very frank, um, I think we have discussed this on LinkedIn and other forums many, many times. You hit upon the most important takeaway, which was just doing the calculations is not going to be sufficient, right? So that's like the simplest part. And what happens next is the important piece. So what's typically, I mean, like, you kind of focus primarily on, companies having access to the models, companies being able to go and actively take part in understanding the data and making sure that they can go ahead with understanding what the models are doing. What in case if I'm going to be buying a model from someone else? I mean, if I don't, these are just primarily hiring software. I think we have a couple of vendors providing software, right? I think Pymetrics, HireView, a bunch of others have software packages. So who's going to hold the, who's responsible for doing these audits? Is it the vendors or is it the people who are going to be using the software, and why?
It depends. Ultimately, at least in credit, it is my understanding is the liability stops with the banks. And so they can't outsource discrimination is the term I've heard used. And so they have the liability, they're going to have the responsibility. But what I have found and what I've seen is that the vendors are all doing the testing themselves. And not all, but virtually all are doing testing themselves and then reporting it to the banks. And in employment, I'm actually seeing the same thing, that we have a number of vendor clients that are doing the testing, potentially customizing it for different clients, but then reporting it. And I think that the New York City law actually envisions that as well, is that if a model is built for a company, the company has to publish the result, but the vendor can do the audit themselves, or the vendor can have the audit done themselves. And that's been the biggest source of growth in our business, has been vendor owned models.
Absolutely. And how about, let's take as a hypothetical situation. I was looking at some of the clarifications which this particular law has, a lot of people had questions. And so I think the latest, which has been released by the City of New York, has a bunch of examples. One is, let's say we are looking at culture fit, or, we are looking at specific employees and looking at the demographics and calculating these metrics. I mean, some of these probably companies are doing it on a regular basis, especially the larger companies. But let's say I'm a 10-person, software company based out of New York. I have my offices in WeWork, and I'm kind of, hiring the next software developer or the next, project manager. And I don't have the data to calculate these kinds of metrics. And is it just going to be a checklist exercise wherein I just have to do it just because I'm expected to do it and not get dinged by the law? Or is there like a bigger picture in here wherein there is, some specific, I mean, like I'm talking about proportionality, like, who has to do it? Mm-hmm. And does it even make sense if there are really small companies who are not even having the data to just put out these metrics and then just follow the law without really kind of, following the spirit of why this law was created in the first place?
Yeah, most anti-discrimination laws have minimum number of people in an employee and at a company for it to be to start affecting them. And so it's interesting if this law does not have that. I mean, to a certain extent, there's security through obscurity, even in a regulatory sense. I cannot imagine, unless a regulator has some sort of personal vendetta against someone, I can't imagine them going after a 10-person company. Now, of course, that's not a sufficient answer. What I think is really going to happen is that the vendors themselves are going to eventually be expected to provide these audits. I think this is going to be a standard part of selling a hiring product in the city of New York, is that you will have to perform and report on a bias audit.
Cool. And also, I think one of the procedural aspects which the law expects is to just kind of do the audit once a year. And now you touched upon, computing these metrics and being able to understand it, potentially control or mitigate it. Now, that's not an expectation of the law. But again, there is going to be a reputation risk. People are going to question if you really see bad numbers for specific companies. And I think that's probably going to drive people to even address some of the issues they've seen. Now, it kind of goes back to the whole area of, ethics washing and, the practices which has kind of come in the industry just to kind of make things look good. So how do we kind of make sure that we have the right structures in place so that it just doesn't become another exercise? Because, I think the spirit is to make sure that companies have kind of done their due diligence and are doing something about what they're observing. First of all, getting educated about what it actually means, not just crunching out these numbers and putting it out there. And then secondly, understanding like what are the impacts of not addressing these, and then addressing those in a more rigorous way, because that's not just a number exercise or a model exercise, right? It's a culture exercise, because everybody needs to be educated on why did we not interview these people, or why did we not select these people, and that kind of gets ingrained throughout the organization on what needs to be done to address the root cause of the data itself, rather than just addressing it as a data problem or a model problem. So what are your thoughts about that?
It is absolutely a hard question, and that are a hard set of questions. I think that more will be revealed slowly, and there's going to have to be an evolutionary process. I think the fact that these have to be publicized is going to really help focus companies' attention and make sure that they are following up and doing the right thing. I am worried about ethics washing. It's very easy to come up with ways to kind of hide the ball. How you're defining populations is a really, really complicated question. Sometimes, particularly in employment, and credit is usually much, much easier thing to do. But in employment, it can be very tricky. And you can come up with plausible ways to do it that are not necessarily right. And you've got some sort of kind of an out there. At the same time, there are limits to that. And so I think really bad employers who are doing bad things it's likely to come to the forefront. So ultimately, I think this is likely a step in the right direction, but there's going to be a lot of growing pains either way.
Absolutely. And I think we have time for one last question. It's 1 o'clock. How do you measure SOLAS quality?
That's a great question.
For another discussion. But one last hard question.
Okay, that one's so that is however the client measures it. So that was actually in that particular case with the AUC. So that I don't remember what the model was, but let's say a model of had an AUC of 0.8, then the 1 represented an AUC of 0.8, and 0.9 represented 0.72 AUC.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. This was very helpful in kind of understanding not only the law, but also the context and the key aspects of what fairness and discrimination is all about and some of the metrics used to measure it. Look forward to continuing the conversation offline, and Nick is available to talk more through his company, Solus.ai. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to him. And also, please stay tuned for our next coming sessions. The next week, we're going to talk about some of the key aspects from a procedural perspective on what vendors should be thinking about and what people who are going to be affected by the law should be thinking about. So I'm going to discuss some of the thoughts I have had and some of the materials we've been putting together as a part of the algorithmic auditing course, which hopefully is going to help in kind of educating you on some of the key aspects of what this all means, rather than you kind of going and doing your own research online and trying to gather information as it comes up. So look forward to talk to you all next week at 12 o'clock Tuesday again. And if you have any questions or feedback, you can reach out to us at info@qsandbox.com. And I would look forward to continuing the discussion through LinkedIn and other means. Thank you so much for participating and looking forward to connecting again.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Nick.
Thanks, Ray.